Yeah, well, I'm not even interested in discussion or debate about whether Christianity is true or whether Jesus is God or whether he's a Messiah or whatever you want to call him, because we don't even need to go there. It's pretty obvious to me that Jesus didn't even exist. He didn't exist any more than Hamlet existed or Zeus existed or anyone else like that. He's just a fictional character. All you got is four books written by the evangelists Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And these guys are clearly deluded fanatics. They believe in miracles, they believe in demons possessing people, people foaming at the mouth. Uh, they're definitely not for women's rights. They don't use inclusive language. Clearly, these people were complete maniacs who should not be listened to, besides the fact that they're religious nuts to begin with. So basically, Jesus didn't exist. Nobody else except these gospel writers ever said he existed, and then Christians just made up this big myth. Nobody else has heard about him. There's no records of his existence anywhere other than the New Testament, and that's a complete fraud. So we don't even need to talk about the claims of Christianity because the whole house of cards falls on this. Thank you very much. When it comes to the question of whether Jesus existed, that has to be separated from the question of if Jesus existed, what was he? Which is completely different and has to be put in another category. The question would then be, was he God? Was he a prophet? Was he the Messiah? Was he a mere man? Was he a liar? Was he a lunatic? That question is completely separate. This one is, did Jesus even exist? And the first thing that has to be understood about that question is that it's not a viable question. It belongs to the nebulous category of pseudo-history. I don't believe that there's a single historian with tenure at any university in the world who would even say that it's an entertainable hypothesis that Jesus did not exist. All the debates about Jesus do not have to do with whether he walked the earth. They just have to do with whether he was this kind of person, that kind of person, or whether there was a hoax surrounded with his existence. Now, the reason why we know he did exist has to do, first of all, with the internal evidence, which there's no reason to dismiss out of hand unless you have an a priori atheist bias that makes you believe that everyone who is religious is necessarily a lunatic and can't be trusted to report on factual events that they see with their own eyes. And if you do take into account the internal evidence, then you have the four Gospels. You also have the letters of Paul, which were written quite before the four Gospels and bear testimony to them. Then you have dozens of other Christian documents like the Didache, the Acts of Solomon, and so on, that were written just a decade or two after Jesus' death. That both bear attestation to his existence. There's also the fact that the majority of scholars are in agreement with the fact that the Gospels themselves were written before 80 AD, and that one or two of them were written around 70 AD. So we're not talking about something that was written hundreds of years later, say as you would be with the life of Buddha, where there's no historical record of him until 500 years after he was supposed to have existed. So we're not dealing with that sort of case. As one historian put it, the evidence, even on a secular level, that Jesus existed is more conclusive than the evidence that points in the direction of Cleopatra or Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great existing. Because, as I said, we not only have the internal evidence, but also the external evidence from sources that aren't religious or aren't Christian at all. One example of a non-Christian source would be Josephus, who's one of the most celebrated historians in antiquity. He was a Jewish historian, a friend of the Roman emperors, and he was paid by them to write history, and he represents a history almost exactly parallel to what the Gospels give in terms of telling us that Jesus exists, he was killed under Pontius Pilate, he was crucified as an upstart, and so on. You also have the most trusted of all Roman historians, and perhaps the most celebrated historian in antiquity, Tacitus, who lived in the generation just after Christ, and he bore witness to him too in his annals. Then you have the Emperor Trajan writing in 90 AD to his procurator in Asia Minor, referring to the Christians, and he noted that these were the people he followed a certain Jesus who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. So you have a Roman historian who was
highly credentialed, and nobody doubts him in any historical department in any university in the world. You also have a Jewish historian of similar credentials, and you have a Roman emperor. If that does not count as external historical evidence for the existence of Christ, nothing could.